everybody. It's your friendly digital technology librarian, Christy here. We've reached another Friday, so of course, I have another Film Rec Friday ready for everybody out there. Now, this week's recs are all about authors. I've got films and documentaries in here that are biographies of really famous authors that depict certain moments within these authors' lives, that tell fictional tales about authors and what it means to be one, and even a documentary that covers an entire genre of novel. So I've tried to do a nice little spread of themes within these. And as always, these recommendations are available entirely for free with the use of your Milan-Berlin library card, and you can find them on one of our video services. Those three services are CleveNet's Overdrive, Hoopla Digital, and Canopy. So without any further ado, let's jump into the recs. All right, let's kick things off with a recommendation from Hoopla Digital, and that is for the 2020 PBS documentary Laura Ingalls Wilder, Prairie to Page. Now, this was a fascinating watch. Laura Ingalls Wilder has always been sort of an interesting literary figure to me to begin with. There's so much built around her that kind of makes her essentially this perfect prairie princess. And what this documentary does so well is it walks a very fine line between strict biography, expose, and puff piece, all wrapped into one. I think that whether you're a fan of Laura Ingalls Wilder, whether you have no idea who she is, or whether you're quite the skeptic with regard to her writing, you'll still find this documentary really, really interesting. So if you don't know, Laura Ingalls Wilder is this very famous slash infamous author of the Little House on the Prairie books. When I was in school, everybody had to read her The Long Winter. Little House on the Prairie, the TV series, was constantly on TV and syndication. I mean, there was never a time that an episode didn't seem to be airing somewhere. It was just sort of the premier depiction of prairie pioneer life, right? Obviously, as time has gone by, more and more people are recognizing how very specifically coded a lot of these stories were. But what this documentary does, I think, incredibly well and sensitively is it speaks to those of us who still really, really love the way that Wilder wrote those stories, and also still manages to not candy coat her life or her writing or anything like that. The base facts of the time and what was actually going on are really very well presented, and in such a way that it's never smarmy. Like, I feel a lot of sort of expose style documentaries can be. This is not that. This is very much a blend of both entertainment and academia. You get both sides, and it's done in such a tasteful way that I think this could work for, like I mentioned, anybody, as far as what your position on Laura Ingalls Wilder is, whether it's fan, non-fan, or someone who has no clue what she did. It is a really interesting blend of interviews with historians, people who studied her life, with essentially like big fans of hers, and narration of her own writings about her life, what had happened. There's an especially fascinating passage in the documentary of letters that were written between Laura Ingalls Wilder and her daughter Rose. And that is presented by Tess Harper and another actress whose name is I'm totally blanking on, and I feel terrible about that. But these two women read the letters back and forth, and it adds so much character and liveliness to this exchange, and you really feel like you're listening in on a conversation, and it's fascinating. Um, One of the best quotes that you hear through the entire documentary, at least for me, that resonated and still does, is a quote from um, sort of a Laura Ingalls Wilder expert that talks about the books. And she says, they show us who we want to think we are. And I think there's nothing more accurate than that statement. It paints this whole picture of those pioneering prairie days as this beautiful, idyllic time. It doesn't delve into all of the complications between relations between the people of the time. It's just very surface, and it's a candy coated rose colored world. And that is exactly I think that's the perfect description for the way a lot of people look at that particular period of time. And this documentary talks about why that is. And I loved that. I thought that was really, really brilliant. We also, as I was mentioning, see exchanges between mother and daughter, between Laura and Rose, that are really very telling, that sort of shed some light onto Rose's largely undiscussed involvement in the books. So we always think of Laura Ingalls Wilder as this great one woman show. She wrote all of these books and it was just this one person, and that's simply not the case. There were a lot of people involved in getting these books to the shelves. And I do really like the way that they talked about that they didn't keep it, again, very much that urban legend vibe. And I think I'm trying to put my words together as far as how much I really did enjoy this. When I went into it, I've always been kind of on the fence with Laura Ingalls Wilder. I've never liked the Little Prairie books. Let me be upfront. I was not a fan of the books, not because of anything about Ingalls Wilder or anything like that. I was not a fan of the writing. I loved reading in school. I hated the long winter so much. I couldn't wait until that particular passage was over, that particular period of time in class was done, because I've never been a big fan of the whole prairie storytelling era, certainly not from Ingalls Wilder's point of view. And this documentary actually made me much more interested in her and potentially going back to read the stories, knowing more about Wilder's life, how she herself was already starting to create a fantasy world. The father in the books was always honestly quite progressive. He was so supportive of his daughters. He paid so much attention. And in that era, it was definitely in a time period when fathers were far more invested in sons, simply because of like the hierarchy of life and what had to be done on, say, like a homestead, and how Ingalls Wilder's father in reality was not necessarily the great provider that Pa was in the books, how he's essentially this perfected version or this vision of what she wanted and had hoped for. And even thinking about that, how she already had adjusted these stories supposedly based on her own childhood. That is absolutely fascinating. And again, it makes me want to go back and read and see, how much she was already, painting with this perfection brush. The documentary also does an excellent job of discussing race relations that would have been going on at the time, and how when we're children reading these books, they're just these pure stories. We don't really necessarily think on other levels about what happened at the time, about, what had to be done in order for these people to pioneer through this uncharted territory. So it does, give a pretty honest depiction of reality versus fantasy versus provided information. I just think that this documentary was really, really fantastically well put together. If you are interested in history, if you are interested in um, pioneer era storytelling, if you are fascinated, like I am, by the whole glossing over of all of the historical details that we have to do in order to romanticize this particular era of time, you absolutely need to watch this documentary. Yes, um, it does center around Laura Ingalls Wilder, but I think because she's such a prominent figure and a figure in that perpetuating of the pioneering days perfection myth, she's the perfect jumping off point. She is someone we can all kind of recognize and see where all of these other things are falling into place. So again, interested in history, interested in fiction, interested in that particular time period, you absolutely have to watch Laura Ingalls Wilder, Prairie to Page. Fascinating documentary and an absolute must watch. Moving right along to my next recommendation, also available on Hoopla Digital, and that is for the 2010 neo-noir thriller, The Ghostwriter. Now, this is a fantastic suspense thriller if you are looking for something that's kind of a throwback to those classic suspenseful movie whodunits, and if you're looking for a movie with tons of twists and turns. Now, in The Ghostwriter, we follow a character we never learn the name. He is a ghostwriter, and let's just refer to him as the Ghost, played by Ewan McGregor. And McGregor's character has just picked up an assignment to ghostwrite the autobiography of a former British Prime Minister named Adam Lang, and Lang is played brilliantly by Pierce Brosnan. And at first, it seems like every other gig. You know, he sits down, does some interviews, gets ready to really start putting some text together. But as he delves into this guy's life, he discovers some really kind of odd and unusual things, decisions that he had made as a prime minister that were maybe kind of questionable, that led to things that were not necessarily things that were good for the country. And as he continues to delve, it starts to really look like there was some potential for really, really shady things bordering on espionage. And of course, once you throw spying in to any political thriller, things really start to go crazy. And this film is no different in that regard. Um, and the Ghost ends up being a wicked good reporter. And he starts to investigate all of these little threads that seem to be left behind. He finds out that there was a ghostwriter prior to him that suffered an unexpected death. uh, and that's really when things start to snowball. While, you know, these kinds of thrillers have a certain amount of predictability to them in that you know more is going to be uncovered, that kind of thing, that you know there'll be twists and turns. The twists and turns that do occur are fascinating. I think they're really, really well written, but even more than that, I think they're very well acted. McGregor does a great job. Pierce Brosnan does a great job, but it's the secondary characters that are really, really fantastic. Olivia Williams plays former Prime Minister Lang's wife, and there are so many scenes where she expresses more with just a shift to her face, like a look to the side or a different kind of glance, a head tilt that's so incredibly effective, even without dialogue. And of course, when her character speaks, it's also really well done. But I love the acting that takes place between the lines. Tom Wilkinson is in it, plays an incredibly interesting character. You've got Timothy Hutton in there, Kim Cattrall. Oh, John Bernthal, like of Walking Dead and the Punisher fame, is in here. I was super like surprised to see him in the cast because it seems like a little bit of an odd casting choice, but he does a great job in here. So it's those secondary characters that really shine, and they're absolutely pivotal to the story. Even though McGregor is very clearly your main character, the one who's unraveling all of these weird, twisted secrets and lies, and he does a great job too. Me harping on about the secondary characters doesn't mean that McGregor doesn't do a fantastic job. He absolutely does, and his interaction with Lang with Brosnan is amazing. Like anytime the two of them are in a scene, it's very taut and really well performed. But again, those secondary characters are really where the story really starts to unfold. Honestly, while I was watching, I really was reminded of so many of those old suspense movies where so much is done in the silences, and so much is done with the camera work as much as it is with the performance from the actors themselves, that everything around is so pivotal to the storytelling. There's this one sequence that takes place in the dark and at night that I just was really on the edge of my seat, not because specifically what was being said or anything like that, but because the darkness was so ominous, and I don't necessarily feel that way a lot with some other thrillers, especially some that I've watched in the recent weeks. This one especially got to me, and I thought that was very well done. So on the whole, really well put together story and film. So if you're looking for a suspenseful film with a really tight storyline, plenty of twists and turns, some of which you really won't see coming, but not in a negative way, not in a oh that was out of left field way, but in a well plotted out thriller and suspense film. Check out The Ghostwriter. It was a surprisingly excellent gem, because honestly I'd not heard about this movie before. It's a Roman Polanski film, and generally those are very well promoted, and I honestly don't recall much about it from 2010. So again, highly recommended The Ghostwriter. Watch it, especially if you are a suspense fan. Okay, moving on to my recommendations from Canopy. The first of those is for a 2016 film called Denial. Now, Denial is based on a true story, the true story of when English author and historian David Irving decided to sue Deborah Lipstadt and Penguin Books for libel when they published Denying the Holocaust. Irving claimed that the book essentially ruined his career because she accused him of distorting historical facts. And this film is all about that ensuing court case that happened in the UK. Now, in the UK, especially within a libel case, the burden of proof is on the defendant. So Lipstadt and Penguin had to figure out a way to defend the things they said about Irving. Now, for those who might not be familiar, Irving, of course, like I said, was an English author, but he was also very much a Holocaust denier. Some of the books that he had written essentially said that, in fact, Hitler did not want to exterminate the Jewish people, that Hitler actually had different plans. I mean, there are a lot of books, and I'm not going to go into all of them or all of the history about that. But Irving is a fascinating figure. His success is absolutely fascinating to me. His well-regarded career, in fact, is fascinating to me. But in any case, what this movie does so well is it doesn't necessarily make his character a mustache twirler, which, again, fascinating to me, because if anybody's the villain of this piece, it's Irving. And I think that's in large part due to the fact that the actor who plays him is so good at doing what I would have to describe as an incredibly nuanced performance for a figure that I can't help but view as a villain. Like, there's no way that I'm not going to look at him and see a villain. And the actor who plays Irving in this is Timothy Spall. Huge fan. He played Peter Pettigrew in Harry Potter. Very good at playing villains. But he's played tons of other characters, not always the bad guy. Anyway, what he does is he makes Irving multifaceted. It would be very easy to just picture Irving as this two-dimensional, mustache twirling monster, but Spall does a good job of making him layered. Why does he think these things? Why does he, in fact, believe that the Holocaust didn't happen? Why? And so you get this incredibly interesting, though still impossible to like, character that is central to this story. Of course, Deborah Lipstadt is played by Rachel Weisz, who is always amazing. I mean, I think she's one of the best actresses out there. And her legal team is played by Andrew Scott and by Tom Wilkinson, and the three of them have phenomenal interplay with one another. Anytime they're discussing things, anytime they're arguing, because there are a lot of points in the legal process where Lipstadt is absolutely opposed to the way that the legal team is handling things. She wants a much more prominent position in her defense. And the lawyers are definitely trying to explain how this is so much bigger than her. This is a huge case that has to be about the situation, and they have a very specific way that they'll need to handle it. And the film does a fantastic job of showing how different even an American viewpoint from a British viewpoint in the legal process is going to be. You know, she is quintessentially American in this. Like, the Lipstadt is definitely looking at it from a very American viewpoint and looking at how the judicial system works in the UK versus the US. I mean, it's already, just from burden being on the defendant, is already one of those big conflicts between all of them. Andrew Scott, who plays Moriarty in the Sherlock series, shows so much more to his character work in this. I really was so impressed with him. And Tom Wilkinson is always amazing. I mean, he's been this phenomenal British character actor for so many years now that I know if I see his name on a cast list, it's going to be good. It's going to be good. Anyway, those three, of course, have their own storylines that we're following, in addition to just seeing Timothy Spall just work wonders with the Irving character. And it's one of those stories where, even though we know the outcome of the case, watching it unfold is so tense. Like, there were so many moments when it was like, oh, what happens next? When obviously I know what happens next. But it doesn't even matter, because it pulls you in, those performances. And it really is the performances more than anything else that makes this a movie that unfolds in the way a fictional story does. So if you are interested, again, in history, if you are fascinated by, I guess, true crime, it's not really true crime, though the Holocaust, obviously. If you are interested in anti-Semitic viewpoint and how it was looked at in this particular time period, the 90s, and how people reacted to discussions about anti-Semitism, because that's a big part of the story too. Like, how are people reacting? How are people responding to what's being said? Make sure you check this out. It is an excellent film. I wasn't even, since this happened in like the early 90s, I wasn't super cognizant of what was going on at the time. I remember vaguely hearing about this court case, but I don't really remember any of the details, but this movie, like, as soon as I finished watching, I went back and I was reading a lot of articles about the court case and what had happened and the people involved. And it's really, really a fascinating period in British history, and world history in general. So again, Denial, available on Canopy, absolute must watch. Okay, my next recommendation, also available on Canopy, is for the 2006 film Infamous. Now, Infamous is a film that tells the story of Truman Capote while he was working on his true life crime novel In Cold Blood. Infamous was vastly overshadowed by the Philip Seymour Hoffman headed Capote movie, which also covered Truman Capote at a very specific time in his life. And Philip Seymour Hoffman even went on to win the Oscar at the time. But I've got to say, Infamous is definitely worth just as much praise, especially for the performances. In this one, Toby Jones plays Truman Capote, and while his take on the character is certainly not the same as Philip Seymour Hoffman's, it's just, I think, as worthwhile of praise. What could easily be a very over the top figure, and he is, like, that's the thing. Truman Capote was such an over the top human being. He was known for being the life of the party. He was sort of the central vortex of rumor at the time. Like, everybody wanted to be around him because he was funny and he was, like, very clever with words. He was also, very savage with criticisms. He was the perfect party guest. And those kinds of characters can very easily be caricatures of themselves when portrayed by actors. Obviously, Philip Seymour Hoffman does an exceptional job with his depiction of Capote, but Jones really, really does some nice, nuanced work here. In Infamous, we are talking about the early 60s, when Capote was working on his true life crime novel, In Cold Blood, which actually was based on and sort of tells the unfolding tale of this Midwestern family's murder, which was a real deal. It ended up, there was this massive manhunt that did, in fact, uncover the two men who had killed this family. And in Infamous, we are sort of seeing the time period when Capote is gathering his information about this murder case. And he ends up going out to this Midwestern penitentiary where the two killers are being held. And he gets to know them. He interviews them. He sees them almost every day for a while. And he develops relationships with them. He even grows to very much care for one of these killers, and it's such a fascinating watch, and it's a difficult watch. As someone who is quite familiar with the stories, I've read In Cold Blood. I looked at all of the true crime stuff afterward because, of course, that's what this book urges you to do in the end. And Capote's growing affection for these guys who are killers, it bleeds across to the audience. You end up feeling for these men. You hear about, like, their childhoods. You hear about the opportunities that were never there for them, and it really starts to blur the line. And again, it's really so much about the acting. Toby Jones, as I mentioned, phenomenal job as Truman Capote, but the two killers are played by Lee Pace, who does an excellent job as Richard Hardock. I'm always forgetting his name. Richard Hickok, who is the younger of the two criminals. And then Daniel Craig is Perry Smith. And Perry Smith is sort of the front man of the two. But he's the one that Capote really seems to develop an affection for. And the more we hear about his life, the more we see him not just as this murderer, but as this fully fleshed out person. And it is disturbing when you think about it, because this was a real person. This is what really happened, both to him and then to the innocent family that he killed. And it's one of those films that just sort of makes your head kind of spin while you're watching it, just because there's so many moments when you can't believe the amount of sympathy that you have for these people, but you really do. And I think that when a film is well done, like this one is, that sort of confusion and frustration is sort of seamlessly integrated. Like, you don't go in expecting to feel for the murder of this like young family. You don't, or at least I certainly didn't. I don't care how much I love Daniel Craig as an actor. Like, that character is a monster, right? But again, like, as the performance and the stories unfold, you really get pulled in. Um, so that the ending scene, again, all of this is based on true fact, so you know what's going to happen at the end of the story. It's not a spoiler, but the end is so affecting because you've gone through this whole 2 hours with all of these conflicting feelings. Excuse me. So this inner conflict you're feeling is the same inner conflict that Capote's feeling, and it's just very hard to watch the end of the movie. If you're looking for a challenging film, one that is incredibly well acted, if you are interested in true crime, because man, like, I don't know how to describe something that is not graphic but graphic. It's not like blood, guts, and gore when they are depicting moments from the murders, but it's very affecting. The We see a lot of scenes in shadow, things that happened that it's very troubling. Um, and that's just another layer to the whole confused viewership that you have while you're watching this movie. So yeah, just if you are interested in true crime, if you like history, if you are a fan of incredibly nuanced performances, and that's the best way to describe some of the acting in here, check out Infamous 2000 from 2006. I actually think that this film is more emotionally engaging than its more critically lauded sibling Capote is. So give it a shot. Give it a shot. It's definitely an interesting watch. Okay, my last recommendation for this week, also available on Canopy, is actually my pick of the week, and that is for the 2016 documentary Love Between the Covers. This is such a fun film. I know it's weird to describe a documentary as fun, but boy, is this one ever. Love Between the Covers is all about the romance novel genre within the publishing industry. And as a fan of romance novels, this one was so insightful, but it was also like really empowering to watch too. So romance fiction outsells all the other genres of writing, from crime to science fiction to fantasy combined. Combined. And when you think about it, like James Patterson, Stuart Woods, all of these authors who are like crazily prolific, and even with all of those authors, to be outsold by this genre that is oftentimes very much poo-pooed by the literati, just gives me warm fuzzies. It really, really does. You know, it talks about how, despite being one of the biggest moneymakers in the publishing industry, it could possibly be looked down on as much as it is. And there's a lot of solid argument to be given to the idea that it's because it's a genre largely written by women, for women, about women. And things are really starting to change, but it's taken a very, very, very long time for it to change. Um, and watching that unfold in the documentary is really interesting. We've got interviews with industry specialists, you've got interviews with romance novel fans. But what I loved the most is that they actually went and spoke to real life, large, popular authors within the romance field. Like, you get interviews with Eloise James, Celeste Bradley, you get interviews with Susan Donovan, you get crossover interviews with tons of other authors, and it really gives you an insight into their position in the publishing world. Some of these authors are just as prolific, if not more so, and just as successful money-wise as, say, a James Patterson, but they aren't necessarily a name that everybody's going to know, again, simply because of genre. Despite the fact that, again, the genre outsells every other genre. I just, again, find that so fascinating. And what this documentary does so well is that it doesn't take itself seriously, which I think is very much a vibe that all of these authors give off themselves. Like, they know that they're never going to get the street cred as these other big name writers, but it doesn't even matter. A lot of the authors were romance novel fans to begin with, and then they shift attention, and how their journey is as much what makes them the authors they are, that makes them tell the stories that they do. And it's just really, really interesting to see all of those bits and pieces unfold. Like, there's so much to the backstories of, say, a Susan Donovan that I'd never been familiar with. And she is as interesting as any of her books. And the other thing that's really fun is, like, the friendships that you see crop up between the authors, because it's like being in the trenches. No, everyone looks down on them in particular, so they find camaraderie amongst themselves. The documentary also looks at, beyond just sexism in the whole industry as a whole, sexism and heteronormativity within the genre. So we get interviews with a few publishing heads who are really trying to expand romance novels within the LGBTQ community, because for years and years this was a largely unrecognized, underserved community of people as well. So we get to see, like, the little inroads that this genre is making into that particular demographic, and some of that storytelling is incredibly hard to watch, because you hear from readers who are talking about representation and never hearing stories, or only hearing stories about people who end up committing suicide at the end of these novels. Like, they go through this period of time when they're reading about, first love and all of that, and then suddenly at the end, realizing that they can't be with the person they want to be with, they kill themselves. That is the worst, saddest thing. And you hear that story over and over and over again. So it's a really interesting, enlightening piece within the documentary as a whole. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. I thought it was so much fun. I thought it was really funny, while being, really open about difficulties and struggles within the writing community. And it's just an interesting watch that there's a levity to, despite it being quite a serious discussion. Again, sexism is always an interesting topic to sort of discuss, and this film does it in a way that makes it approachable. And I think that's one of those things that's really hard to do. So again, my pick of the week, Love Between the Covers. Excellent documentary. Must watch. Okay, so that is it for this week's recommendations. I hope that you found something within these recs that will speak to you, that you will check out. If you have any recommendations for us with regard to movies about authors or stories that you want us to check out, make sure you comment with those below. I am always looking for recommendations because, I love movies. If you have any recommendations for future themes that you'd like to see us cover, comment with those too. Definitely need help with that. As always, thank you, thank you, thank you for watching. I love putting together these lists and I always find it a lot of fun. So feedback is definitely appreciated. With that, I am going to draw this episode to a close. Again, thank you for watching and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.